Just sign where I marked, Calvin. At your age, nobody expects you to understand the restructuring. Bryce Halden said it in front of the board, the cameras. And Naomi, the daughter who had spent 3 months warning that something inside her father's company was being rewritten. By sunset, Calvin Reddick's laboratory key had been taken. Naomi had been removed from her job. And a scanned signature was being used to claim the 71-year-old founder had willingly surrendered his voting rights and the patents he had spent 40 years building. Calvin never raised his voice. He only looked at the pen, smiled, and signed. 6 days later, Bryce carried the original contract into court and called it proof no honest man could deny. The document examiner placed the signature page under controlled heat. The ink faded. Calvin's name disappeared. A moment later, the page before the judge was completely blank. Bryce had tried to use an old man's signature to erase him from his own company. He had not realized the old man had spent a lifetime studying the kind of ink that remembered temperature. But had Calvin outsmarted a thief, or destroyed the evidence that could save everyone else? If you believe quiet strength is measured by what a father protects, subscribe to Dad's Quiet Strength. Here's how it happened. 6 days earlier, Calvin stood at his kitchen counter, sharpening 2 yellow pencils. He had done the same thing before every important day of Naomi's childhood. The first day of 3rd grade, her science fair, her college entrance exam. The morning she interviewed for her first laboratory job, Naomi was 38 now. She managed quality assurance at Reddick Thermal Materials, wore her hair pulled back when she was worried, and earned more in a month than Calvin had earned in his first year as a chemist. Since her mother died, the pencil ritual had belonged to the two of them. None of Naomi's success stopped him from testing each point against his thumb. At 71, Calvin's beard had gone silver against his dark skin. He had stepped away from daily management, but his 43% voting block, retirement income, and life's work remained tied to the company. Dad. He looked up. Naomi had spread 2 copies of the succession agreement across the kitchen table. Her notes ran in blue ink down the left margin. One copy was marked 910. The other carried a later version number. The appendix changed, she said. The version we approved protects the technical staff and keeps your veto over patent transfers. This one doesn't. Calvin set the pencils beside her hand. The ceremony packet may have been generated from an old draft. That is what Bryce said the last 2 times. There was no anger in her voice yet. That was worse. Naomi had spent months bringing him missing approvals, shortened review windows, and document links that quietly expired. Each time Calvin had asked for one more piece of proof, he told himself he was protecting her. Bryce was the chief executive. Naomi reported into a division Bryce controlled. If Calvin accused him too soon, Bryce could make her life impossible. What Calvin had not admitted was that asking Naomi for more proof also allowed him to postpone a painful truth. 10 years earlier, when the company had nearly lost its largest customer, Bryce had worked every phone, every weekend, and every desperate meeting until the contract survived. Calvin had rewarded him with access, authority, and trust. Now Naomi was asking him to consider that his judgment had become the danger. Calvin picked up his phone. He photographed the approved 910 draft and sent the full file to his attorney with a short message. Preserve this version. Request the document activity log immediately. Naomi watched him send it. And at the meeting, she asked, I'll make sure the right document is signed. Quietly, carefully. She looked at the 2 pencils, then pushed them back across the table. I don't need you to sharpen things for me anymore, she said. I need you to believe me before Bryce decides what counts as proof. Calvin felt the sentence settle in the room. He could have told her that he did believe her now. But he had said versions of that before, always followed by a private call, a quiet correction. And another month in which Naomi stood alone inside the company. She closed the later draft and placed it in her bag. At the front door, Calvin reached for his old brown coat. Its elbows had gone soft with age. On the shelf beneath it sat a scratched metal pen box he had carried through 4 decades of demonstrations and patent meetings. He slipped the box into his pocket. The headquarters of Reddick Thermal Materials had changed since Calvin stopped running daily operations. The original brick laboratory still stood at the center, but glass offices now rose around it. The lobby displayed product awards beneath a wall-sized photograph of Bryce. Calvin's own portrait had been moved to a narrow corridor leading toward the older labs. At the security gate, a young consultant in a fitted gray suit tapped his temporary badge and walked through without slowing. Calvin placed his badge against the reader. The light flashed red. He tried once more, red again. The security attendant stared at the screen, then at Calvin's worn coat. "Sir, this credential has been restricted. I have a signing meeting upstairs." The consultant glanced back. "He's with the event, I think." The attendant smiled at the consultant, thanked him, and then turned to Calvin with the careful patience people used when they had already decided an older man was confused. "Founder guests are checking in at reception." "I am not a founder guest." Naomi stepped through the adjacent gate and held up her badge. "He is Calvin Reddick." The attendant's face changed, but the gate did not. He called upstairs. After a brief conversation, he printed Calvin a visitor sticker and told him that operational access had been removed for today's transition. Calvin pressed the sticker to his coat. The adhesive caught on the fabric and leaned crooked. The consultant's temporary badge had opened the laboratory corridor. The man who had built the laboratory had been given permission to visit it. Naomi wanted to argue. Calvin touched her elbow and kept walking. Outside his old lab, 3 cardboard boxes sat against the wall. His notebooks had been packed between framed photographs and demonstration pieces. On top lay a paper card Naomi had made when she was 8. A yellow sun had once appeared when the card was cold and faded when it warmed in her hands. Bryce stood inside the lab with 2 consultants. He held the card by one corner. "We're clearing the school tricks," he said. "The licensing team needs a clean workspace." Calvin took the card from him and set it inside the top box. "Some of those school tricks became the products you're licensing." Bryce smiled for the consultants. "And that is why today is about honoring the past while giving the future room to work." June Mercer, Bryce's executive assistant, approached with a black document case hugged against her chest. She had worked at the company for 14 years, long enough to know that Calvin never signed a page he had not read. Her eyes moved toward Bryce, then back to Calvin. "The ceremony set changed," she said quietly. "The final packet was replaced after I printed the approved one." "June." Bryce called. She straightened. Calvin asked, "Which version is on stage? I wasn't allowed to reopen it." Bryce stepped between them. "The board is waiting." Calvin held his gaze. "Then give me 20 minutes to compare the packet with the 910 draft. We have cameras, counsel, and a licensing partner on a live schedule. 20 minutes. Bryce lowered his voice. "If you delay this, the technical protections Naomi demanded become the first thing the partner reopens. Is that what you want for her department?" The threat was polished enough to sound like business. "Sign now, or the people Naomi had fought to protect would pay for Calvin's caution." Bryce turned toward the consultants. "Please show our founder emeritus to the stage." Founder emeritus, the title sounded respectful. It also told everyone in the hall that Calvin belonged to the past. The signing platform had been built in the company atrium. Employees stood behind a rope line. Board members sat beneath white lights. 2 cameras faced a long table where the contract waited in a blue folder. Naomi sat in the second row, rigid and silent. Bryce spoke for 12 minutes about speed, modern leadership, and the courage to release old structures. Then he invited Calvin to the table as the man whose early vision made today possible. Calvin opened the folder. The first pages matched the 910 draft. The final appendix was tucked behind the execution sheet. Before he could lift it, Bryce placed one hand over the stack. "We've completed review," Bryce said into his microphone. Calvin reached for the microphone beside him. "I need the record to reflect." Bryce switched it off. The small green light went dark. A few board members looked down. Naomi rose halfway from her seat. Bryce leaned close enough that only the front row could hear him. "Do not turn your daughter's department into a casualty of your pride." Calvin felt heat rise beneath his collar. For one sharp second, he wanted to take the blue folder, tear the appendix free, and tell the cameras exactly what Bryce had done. Then he saw Naomi. She was not asking him to save her job. She was waiting to see whether he would finally stand beside her, warning. Calvin reopened his microphone. Bryce reached for the switch, but Calvin spoke before he could kill it again. "My signature applies only to the 9-10 succession draft reviewed by both parties. It does not approve later additions." The sentence traveled through the atrium and into both cameras. Bryce paused, then he smiled. "Exactly," he said. "The succession agreement. Please sign." Calvin removed the scratched metal box from his coat. Inside were 2 old demonstration pens and the 2 pencils Naomi had left on the kitchen table. One pen carried a tiny brass notch near the converter. Calvin had cut that notch himself years ago to mark an experimental black ink that turned clear above a controlled temperature and returned when cooled. Bryce saw an old man clinging to a familiar pen. Calvin saw a way to stop Bryce from carrying the original into a private vault and calling the dispute finished. He wrote the date, the version reference, and his name on the separate execution sheet. The thermochromic ink dried black. Then he closed the pen. Applause began because the event staff started it. Bryce took the folder before Calvin could touch the appendix. At the edge of the stage, a security manager held out his hand. "Mr. Halden has requested your remaining keycard." Calvin looked at Bryce. "Temporary access control," Bryce said. "Nothing personal." Calvin removed the old laboratory card from his wallet. The photograph showed him at 53, his beard still black, his eyes tired from the year they had opened the new production wing. The security manager dropped it into a clear plastic pouch. Behind Calvin, the next speaker began praising a new era. He stepped down from the stage with the visitor sticker still crooked on his coat. Naomi followed him into the empty corridor. "You signed it," she said. "I limited what I signed. You heard him threaten my department, and you signed. There are things he doesn't know." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed level. "That is always your answer. You know something. You are handling something, and I am supposed to wait until your silence saves me." Calvin reached into the pen box and held out one of the pencils. Naomi looked at it, then at him. She placed both pencils on the windowsill between them. "I needed a father in that room," she said. "Not a plan I'm not allowed to understand." She walked away without looking back. For the first time that day, Calvin wondered whether he had stopped Bryce, or simply found a more sophisticated way to avoid saying what Naomi needed to hear. By 3 that afternoon, Bryce had filed the signed restructuring package with the company's internal records office. His announcement reached every employee before Calvin reached the parking lot. The succession agreement is complete. Executive authority has transferred. All operational decisions now report through the chief executive's office. Calvin read the message beneath the rain canopy. A second notice followed. His company email was disabled. His laboratory access was revoked indefinitely. His right to approve patent transfers had been marked as surrendered. Then Naomi called. She did not cry. That frightened him more than tears would have. "He fired me." Calvin stood very still. "On what grounds?" "Conflict of interest." He said, "My objections were an attempt to protect your personal holdings." "Where are you?" "In the quality office. Security is waiting for me to pack." Through the glass doors, Calvin could see employees moving between the atrium and the elevators. The company continued around him as if his name had already been removed from the building. "Listen to me," he said. "Take your bag and your personal things. Do not copy files, do not forward records, do not give him a reason to call you dishonest. So I leave him everything. You leave him everything the company owns. The truth does not become safer because we steal it back. There was a pause. And June? Naomi asked. Calvin saw June inside the lobby, standing beside the black document case. Her face was pale. Tell her the same thing. No secret downloads, no papers under a coat. Calvin called his attorney next. Send the preservation notice, he said. The approved 910 file, every later version, the access history, the scan, and both ceremony videos. Did he file the transfer? Yes. Then we move today. Calvin looked through the glass as security escorted his daughter across the lobby. Naomi carried one small box. Bryce walked behind her speaking to a board member, not even watching the consequence he had ordered. Calvin's hand closed around the scratched pen case. The ink had bought him a future question. It had not protected Naomi from the present answer. The next morning, Calvin sat across from his attorney, while the 910 draft lay open between them. The document was simple where it mattered. Calvin would step away from the remaining operational committees. Bryce would continue as chief executive. Technical positions would be protected through the licensing transition. Most important, any transfer of the company's core patents would still require Calvin's approval. The filed package contained one additional appendix. That appendix transferred the patents to a new holding company and treated Calvin's signature on the execution sheet as approval of the entire package. His attorney placed the two versions side by side. Your preserved file does not contain this. Naomi was right. Yes. Calvin looked at the blue notes in the margin of her copy. He had spent months asking whether each missing record could be explained. Now the explanations had assembled themselves into a weapon aimed at both of them. The first activity report showed that a new appendix had entered the system less than an hour before the ceremony. It did not yet identify who had created it. The deeper server log was held by an outside records vendor and would take time to obtain. His attorney tapped the scanned execution page. Tell me about the pen. Calvin opened the scratched metal box. A reversible thermochromic formula, he said. It writes black at room temperature. Controlled heat makes it clear. Sufficient cooling brings the color back. And you knew when you signed. I knew Bryce was trying to prevent review. I knew June said the packet had changed. I did not know what he had added. Why not refuse? Calvin thought of Bryce's hand on the microphone. He thought of Naomi in the second row, waiting for him to trust what she already knew. I believed the signature could force the original into neutral custody if he used it against me. And I believed I could keep him from cutting Naomi's department while I challenged the transfer. His attorney leaned back. He fired her anyway. Calvin closed the box. Yes, she did not soften the next warning. A blank page will not win this case. Bryce has a scan. He has video of you signing. He has your smile. If the ink disappears, he will say you designed a trap because you regretted the deal. Then the page is not our proof. It is leverage. It may stop him from treating the original as unquestionable. The proof has to be the version you approved, the words you spoke on camera, the file history, and whoever changed the packet. Calvin nodded. The ink could open a locked door. It could not tell the court what had happened on the other side. On the third day, Bryce called an emergency board meeting and allowed Calvin to attend by video only. Calvin's face appeared on a wall screen while Bryce sat at the head of the table inside the room Calvin had once chaired. Naomi was not allowed to join. June sat near the door with a legal pad resting untouched on her knees. Bryce played the ceremony recording. On screen, Calvin stated that his signature applied only to the 910 succession draft. Bryce answered, exactly. Then Calvin signed. Bryce froze the image on Calvin's small smile. This is buyer's remorse, he said. Calvin understood enough to bring a specialized pen, understood enough to make a limiting statement, and understood enough to wait until after the transition before objecting. Calvin watched board members study his face on the frozen screen instead of the extra appendix. Bryce continued, "We cannot manage a modern materials company through a founder's memories and last-minute suspicions." One director shifted uncomfortably. The board's outside counsel lifted a hand. "The version discrepancy is not a memory," she said. "We should pause the patent transfer for one day and let the records vendor complete its review." It was the third clean opportunity Bryce had been given to stop. June had warned that the packet changed. Calvin had asked for 20 minutes. Now board counsel was asking for one day. Bryce refused all three. "The licensing deadline is Friday," he said. "A delay will cost the company the transaction. We have an original signature and a complete video. File for recognition of the transfer." June looked up. For one brief moment, her eyes met Calvin's image on the wall. He did not ask her to rescue him. He only said, "Please preserve your notes." Bryce ended the call. 3 days later, the original execution sheet rested beneath a clear cover in an emergency civil hearing. Bryce had brought it to court because he wanted the judge to enforce the transfer before the licensing deadline. His attorney called it the one piece of evidence no later complaint could change. Calvin sat beside his attorney. Naomi sat behind him. She had spoken to him only about the case since her firing. The 2 pencils remained on his kitchen windowsill. The court-appointed document examiner wore protective gloves. She photographed the page at room temperature, recorded its condition, and placed it on a flat laboratory plate brought into the courtroom under the judge's order. Bryce's attorney objected one last time. "This is an original corporate record. It should not be subjected to a founder's experiment." The examiner did not look at Calvin. "The temperature will remain within the tested range. The process is reversible. Every stage will be documented." The judge allowed her to continue. At first, nothing happened. Calvin saw Bryce relax. Then the date began to thin. The black strokes softened to gray. Calvin's initials faded next. His signature held for another few seconds, dark against the white page, then disappeared from the final letter backward until only a faint line remained. The line vanished. The execution sheet was blank. No one gasped. The silence was more complete than that. Bryce's attorney stopped in the middle of a sentence. Bryce leaned forward as if distance were the problem. "That is not possible." The examiner lifted the temperature reading for the judge to see. "The visible writing has entered its clear state," she said. "I cannot determine from this test why the ink was used or what legal agreement the signer intended. I can only confirm that the writing on this sheet is thermochromic and that the original is not the permanent record it was represented to be." Bryce stood. "Return the document. This is company property." The judge looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Halden." He remained standing for half a second too long. Then he sat. It was the first order of his that had failed in public. The judge directed the clerk to seal the original in court custody. The patent transfer was frozen until the version history and the circumstances of the signing could be examined. Calvin heard the decision, but he watched Naomi. She was looking at the blank page. There was relief in her face, but not trust. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered near the elevators. Calvin and Naomi moved toward a quiet end of the corridor. Before they reached it, Bryce stepped into their path. His confidence had returned, sharpened by anger. "You planned that," he said. Calvin did not answer. Bryce held up a tablet displaying the scanned signature. "The scan exists. The video exists. You smiled while you signed. All you proved in there was that you brought disappearing ink into a corporate ceremony. I proved your unquestionable original had a question, and I will prove you manufactured that question." Bryce glanced at Naomi. "We can end this today. Calvin gets his voting rights restored. His retirement distributions remain untouched. Naomi's termination becomes a resignation with a neutral reference." Naomi's jaw tightened. "In exchange?" Calvin asked. "She leaves the company. Both of you sign confidentiality agreements. The licensing transaction proceeds." Bryce lowered his voice. "Take the win." You keep your name. She keeps her career. No one has to hear how deliberately you staged that courtroom trick. For 6 days, Calvin had wanted enough uncertainty to stop the transfer. Bryce was offering exactly that. His rights, his income, Naomi's record. All without Calvin admitting that he had ignored her warnings or explaining why so many employees had been asked to trust documents they were not allowed to review. Naomi looked at her father. This time she did not ask him what his plan was. She waited to see whether he would include her in the decision. Calvin turned to her. "Do you want that agreement?" Naomi studied Bryce's face, then the tablet in his hand. "No," Bryce gave a short laugh. "You are unemployed because of him. I'm unemployed because I found the wrong version. You found a clerical disagreement and turned it into a family war." Calvin stepped between them without touching Bryce. "Send the offer through counsel. It expires tonight, then it expires tonight." Bryce walked away, but not before telling Naomi that speaking to June about company records would be treated as theft of confidential information. At Calvin's house that evening, the blank-page victory felt smaller than it had in court. The old Sun card lay on the kitchen table beside the 2 pencils. Naomi had recovered it from the box security gave her after her dismissal. One edge had peeled where Bryce had bent it. Calvin set a copy of the proposed agreement beside it. "The court froze the transfer," he said. "That gives us time. The blank page may be enough to keep the patents from moving while the case continues." "And June?" "The preservation order protects the records." I asked about June. Calvin looked up. Naomi's voice remained controlled, but 3 months of exhaustion sat behind it. "Bryce told her she could lose her job and be sued if she speaks. He did the same thing to 2 engineers last year. They signed revised compensation papers after being given 10 minutes to read them. One of them has been fighting a repayment claim ever since." "I didn't know that. Because every time someone warned you, you fixed the immediate problem in private. Bryce learned that your silence was part of the system." Calvin touched the edge of the court order. The page stopped him. It stopped him from using one original. Naomi pushed the proposed confidentiality agreement back toward him. "Don't make the paper disappear for what you need to say." The sentence hurt because it named the difference between strategy and courage. Calvin had signed with thermochromic ink because he understood materials better than Bryce ever would. He could keep the page blank and force Bryce to carry the burden of uncertainty. He might recover his rights without placing his own judgment under examination. But June would still be alone. Naomi's warnings would still be framed as a daughter protecting her father. And Calvin would still be the powerful man quietly repairing damage after asking everyone else to prove it first. He picked up the agreement and tore nothing. He simply placed it in the recycling bin. "Call our attorney," he said. "Tell her I'm filing a statement. About Bryce, about me." The independent records vendor delivered the DEPA log the next morning, the approved 9. 10 file had been locked after final review. 47 minutes later, a copy was created under Bryce's executive credentials. The patent transfer appendix was added to that copy. Minutes before the ceremony, June had been ordered to replace the packet and disable side-by-side review on the presentation tablet. The scan told the rest. A digital examiner found that Calvin's signature had been cut from the execution sheet and placed beneath the added appendix in the filed image. The spacing changed around his name. A thin border from the original page traveled with the crop. Then Calvin's attorney found a side agreement in the preserved executive files. If the patents moved to the new holding company before the licensing deadline, Bryce would receive a large transaction bonus and a protected chief executive position. Calvin read it twice. 10 years earlier, Bryce had earned authority by saving the company. Calvin had allowed gratitude to become weak oversight. He had given Bryce too much control over the records, then treated Naomi's warnings as a family problem to manage quietly. The evidence implicated Bryce. It also exposed Calvin's failure to build a system that did not depend on his private corrections. June agreed to testify only after the court issued protection against retaliation. When Calvin met her at his attorney's office, she kept both hands around a paper cup. He said, "I would never work in the industry again," she told him. "You should not have to risk your career to correct my mistake." June looked surprised. "Mr. Reddick, you didn't order the change. I gave one executive the power to change a final packet without a second approval. Then I ignored the person who told me that power was being misused." He signed his sworn statement in permanent blue ink. It acknowledged the access he had granted Bryce, the warnings he had failed to escalate, and the financial loss the company could face if the licensing deal collapsed. The statement did not excuse Bryce. It removed the excuse Calvin had been keeping for himself. At the second hearing, Bryce's attorney displayed the blank execution sheet and the ceremony video on two separate screens. "Mr. Reddick engineered uncertainty," she argued. "He asks this court to reward a trap." Calvin's attorney rose with the sealed pen box, the preserved 910 draft, and Calvin's sworn statement before she could begin. Bryce offered the confidentiality agreement one final time. Calvin looked at Naomi. She sat beside June behind the counsel table, not behind him. "No," he said. His attorney handed the judge the sworn statement. Calvin did not hide the pen. He did not deny knowing what Heat would do. He accepted that the licensing deal might fail, and that his own decisions would be reviewed. Then he asked the court-appointed examiner to complete the reversible test. The sealed execution sheet was placed on a cooled surface. For several seconds, it remained blank. Bryce watched with the faint confidence of a man who believed disappearance was the final state. A gray curve emerged near the bottom. The curve darkened into the first letter of Calvin's name. The date returned. His initials appeared. Slowly, stroke by stroke, the signature came back until it lay across the page in full black ink. Calvin did not look at Bryce. He looked at the judge. "I signed my name," he said. "I did not sign the contract he attached it to." The restored signature did not win the case by itself. The proof came in 4 clear links. First, the court watched the uncut ceremony video. Calvin's voice was unmistakable. His signature applied only to the 910 succession draft. Bryce's answer was just as clear. Exactly. Second, the preserved 910 draft appeared on the screen. It contained no patent transfer appendix. Third, the independent log showed the added appendix entering a copied file after approval. The scan analysis showed Calvin's signature being cropped from the execution sheet and placed beneath language he had never reviewed. Finally, June took the witness chair. She described warning Bryce that the packet number did not match. She described Calvin asking for 20 minutes. She described the order to replace the packet and prevent comparison. Bryce's attorney asked whether Bryce had ever used the word fraud. "No," June said. "Did he tell you to forge Mr. Reddick's signature?" "No. Then you assumed wrongdoing." June looked toward Bryce. Her hands trembled once, then became still. "He told me the signature was all that mattered." The board's outside counsel stood before the hearing ended. She withdrew her support for Bryce's request and confirmed that she had advised a delay when the version discrepancy first surfaced. The judge refused to recognize the transfer. The patent rights and Calvin's voting authority remained under the earlier agreement. The altered filing and the treatment of the evidence were referred for the appropriate civil and regulatory review. Bryce was not taken away in handcuffs. There was no dramatic arrest in the aisle. He left the courtroom without the authority he had entered with. That afternoon, the board suspended him. After an independent review confirmed the document changes, the pressure placed on June, and Naomi's retaliatory dismissal, he was removed for cause. Naomi's employment record was corrected. Her withheld pay was restored. She returned to quality assurance under an independent reporting line. She was not made chief executive. Calvin did not use one injustice as an excuse to hand his daughter a throne. June kept her job and received written protection against retaliation. Calvin kept his shares and patents, but he did not escape cost. The licensing deal collapsed. The company's value fell. Every authority change he had approved during Bryce's rise was reviewed, including his own failures of oversight. He accepted that review without asking anyone to call it loyalty. 6 weeks later, Calvin stood with Naomi outside a glass meeting room as process engineer entered carrying a red notebook. She had no founder's name, no board seat, and no powerful parent in the building. Naomi watched from the glass corridor as the meeting secretary handed her 2 versions of the agreement, a clean copy and one showing every change. "You have 5 business days," the secretary said. "You may take both to your own attorney. Your job will not be affected by questions or refusal." The engineer looked surprised. Then she placed both copies in her bag and walked out without being stopped. That was the reform Calvin trusted most. Not a new slogan on the wall. Not his portrait returning to the lobby. One ordinary employee had been given the time and safety that powerful people once treated as an inconvenience. That evening, Naomi opened the pen box at Calvin's kitchen table. The 2 old demonstration pens rested beside the pencils. She took one pencil and returned the other to him. Together, they repaired the peeling edge of the sun card with a thin strip of clear tape. Then Naomi placed it inside the refrigerator. They waited. When she brought it back, pale yellow spread across the surface. The small sun returned slowly, uneven at first, then bright enough to see. Calvin held the card between both hands. "You were telling me the truth," he said. "I made you prove it alone. I'm sorry." Naomi did not tell him it was fine. It had not been fine. She sat beside him and pressed the repaired edge flat with her thumb. "Next time," she said, "stand beside me before the courtroom." Calvin nodded. "Next time, a signature can disappear. Responsibility cannot." Calvin did not prove his strength by denying his own name. He proved it by bringing that name back, admitting where his silence had helped the wrong man, and standing beside the daughter he should have believed sooner. Dignity does not come from owning a company or inventing something powerful. It begins when the truth is heard, before the person telling it has to become powerful enough to force the room to listen. If you believe real strength means protecting the truth even when it costs you, subscribe to Dad's Quiet Revenge. Would you have kept the page blank or brought the signature back?